Hello, welcome to the first speaker series from NCITE for 2025. We are NCITE, the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, which is the Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence for Terrorism Prevention and Counterterrorism Research. My name is Gina Ligon, and I'm the director of NCITE. I have the privilege of introducing our first speaker series of 2025. I'm thrilled that you're all here and that we get to learn from today's speaker. It's a regular series that we started last year, and a program is the goal to hear directly from government leaders so that we can demystify their work and be more responsive in the research that we conduct for them. Before I introduce today's moderator, I want to be able to give a couple of housekeeping items so that we can keep everything running smoothly today. So this is a Zoom platform, and what that means is one-to-many. So all of your microphones or cameras are muted. We have over 250 of you watching today. Very grateful for your time and attention. We do want this to be interactive. So this will be about a 45-minute discussion with Seamus Hughes and Trini Ross. And we have some planned questions, but really we want to take questions from the government, or from the audience, sorry. So if you all are able to use the chat function and the Q&A function to submit your questions, if you're comfortable with us sharing your name and your organization, please put that in brackets as well. If we don't see your name and organization, we'll just assume that you want to be an anonymous viewer, which is absolutely fine. But we want to be able to get your questions answered as well. We'll record today's session, and just later we'll be able to put it out on our website. And so you can watch it later or share it with friends, as well as a recap of today's events with the registrants who are here. Both of those will be posted on our website. I also wanted to put a plug in for our next speaker series. It's our U.S. and Customs and Border Protection, the National Targeting Center's George Comas is going to speak in March. So please take a look at that. It's going to be on March 5th at 11 a.m. Central Time, and we'll be in the same platform. So once you get the registration, please, or invitation, please register for that event as well. So today, we have Seamus Hughes moderating our program. So Seamus is a senior researcher and policy associate at NCITE. But before he was here, he had a long storied career in government as well as at George Washington's program on extremism. So he's worked both on the Hill, and he's worked for one of our closest partners in the IC, the National Counterterrorism Center. As you all know, he's widely respected for his expertise in the federal court system. And he has a project at NCITE that's about prosecuting terrorism suspects on non-terrorism charges. And so today's talk is very pertinent and germane to what he's researching, and we're very excited about his work. His newest release will come out. It's an explainer about Atomwaffen and some of the charges that they have received that are not related to terrorism in the United States. So wanted to turn it over to Seamus to be able to introduce our guest speaker and launch into Q&A. So thanks for being here. Seamus, go ahead.
Thanks, Jane. I appreciate it. Again, my name is Seamus Hughes. I'm a senior researcher at NCITE. I'm very excited about this event. Unfortunately, it's became quite timely in recent weeks. We saw the murder of 14 people in New Orleans and the injuring of 35 others by an individual who appears to be supporting ISIS and that ideology. We saw another attack in Las Vegas and a number of arrests in the last week or so. And so the point of this series is to look at and demystify some of the ways of how we prosecute terrorism in the U.S. Article 3 and other statutes allow us to go after these individuals, hold them to justice, and go from there. What I'm really excited about is, about 3 or 4 months ago, I was listening to a podcast called Demystifying the Department of Justice, and it was put out by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Western District of New York. I found it fascinating. You had a U.S. attorney who was willing to talk about how they actually work cases, right? And what is the nitty-gritty of it all. And so when I heard the podcast, I thought to myself, this is a great opportunity to continue that conversation. As part of our research at NCITE, we've been looking at non-terrorism charges for terrorism suspects. So you arrest a white supremacist for a gun charge or a drug charge, and what is the second and third order effects of those type of things. And so today I'm very, very excited to welcome U.S. Attorney Trini Ross, who is the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of New York. Ms. Ross has a very storied and career at Department of Justice. She's been a U.S. Attorney since 2021. That includes the Western District is 17 counties in New York. So the chief law enforcement officer for that area. She has worked in a variety of different places at Department of Justice, including heading the Attorney General's Advisory Committee on for a number of years. She was a assistant U.S. attorney for nearly 2 decades, and so has seen it from the very, very bottom of a U.S. attorney's office to the very, very top of it all. And the Western District of New York punches above its weight. We've seen a lot of interesting cases coming out of there, whether it be the Lackawanna 6 cases with Al Qaeda or the Tops supermarket shooting a few years back. We've seen these kind of terrorism cases percolating up through that district. And so what I thought we'd do today is kind of dive into what that looks like. What does a day-to-day operation look like at a U.S. Attorney's office? And what do we learn from that on there? And so with this, so the housekeeping is Ms. Ross is going to give a few minutes of an opening remarks, kind of frame a little bit of the conversation, but it's really going to be a back and forth. And so I encourage you throughout the conversation to throw in questions into the chat. I will take the ones that are normal and not insane, and then we'll go from there. Ms. Ross?
Good afternoon or good morning for those of you on the Pacific time zone. I'm Trini Ross. I'm the United States Attorney for the Western District of New York. As Seamus said, before I became United States Attorney, I worked in this office that I now run for, actually, it was over 2 decades, Seamus, but we don't really have to talk about that.
It doesn't look like a day over 1 year. You're fine.
A very long time. And in that role, I was able to be boots on the ground, front line. So by the time I got to be in this role as United States Attorney, I have a complete, deep understanding of how the process, this office, the courts in this district, law enforcement in this district works from top to bottom. So that's really, I think, has been very helpful to some of the cases that we've had to deal with here, because Seamus, like you said, there are terrorism cases in this district, as well as other important cases. And having the knowledge and the background that I had as a prosecutor, a line prosecutor, a line supervisor, senior lit counsel in this district has been very useful to the work that I've done as U.S. Attorney. So thank you again for inviting me. My podcast is Feds Demystified, because I think it's really important that people understand what we do. There should be no secrecy unless there has to be like grand jury or different law enforcement sensitive information. Other than that, we're public servants, and we need to let the public know what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. So I'm here to answer these questions.
Great. I've never get an opportunity to like cross-examine a U.S. attorney, so this is a good experience for me. I'm very excited about it.
I was a witness once. I was a very bad witness. I just want you to know.
Well, I won't treat you as hostile. We're okay. Well, let's pull a little bit on that. So, you've been a prosecutor for more than 2 decades now. Walk me through what a day-to-day looks like for an AUSA, an assistant U.S. attorney.
Yes, there's no typical day. There really isn't. It depends on what's happening in our community. So when I was here, I started in 1995, and I was always in the white collar general crime section, which means I did complex white collar crimes, and I did civil rights, I did human trafficking, and no day was ever the same. It depended on what happened. So in the white collar section, we are on duties. There's always someone, an attorney in all 94 U.S. attorneys' offices who's on duty 24/7, 365, right? So that's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year, including holidays. And crazy things happen, and we're on a border state. So if my curtains weren't closed, you could see Canada from my office. You could literally look out my window and see Canada. And we have 3 bridges on the port here, and things are happening. People are trying to smuggle drugs, so that would go to our narcotics and organized crime unit. People are trying to smuggle people. That would be in our white collar general crime unit. People are smuggling drugs and guns and all sorts of things, even fruit. There's some fruit you can't bring into the country. And so you could come into work thinking, today I'm going to work on that motion response, and something crazy is happening out there and you push your motion response aside and you file a criminal complaint. You get, you work with the agents, you get information, you see if there is a charge to be had. And if there is, you're helping the agent write an affidavit, you're filing a criminal complaint, you're going to court, you're doing an initial appearance, an arraignment, and things are spiraling. So the short answer is never a typical day.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it keeps your life interesting, I guess.
It does. And that's how I was here so long.
Well, I mean, I have a simple question, I think, right? Which is, when do you determine what goes federal and when do you go to the district attorney's office on these things? Like, an FBI agent comes to your folks and says, I've got this great case. What do you all do after that?
We look to see if what they're telling us is accurate, because agents often think their cases are great and they often think they're ripe and ready to go. We as prosecutors don't always agree. And that's the checks and balances on the system, which I think is very important. We don't just take everything that comes in the door because a law enforcement officer of any type tells us it's a great case. They could bring it in the door, and then we need to do a complete neutral evaluation of the evidence that they brought us to make sure they're looking at the right things. Every crime has elements to it, and our job as prosecutors is to fulfill those elements. So literally, agents would come to my door and say, Trini, this is the greatest case ever. We're ready to file charges. And I was like, okay, let me take a look at that. And I would look and I would print off the elements of the statutes that we're looking at. And I would circle and say, well, this isn't done because you don't have this element. We can't meet this element, or we can't meet that element. And so I'm giving this paper to you so you know exactly what I'm looking for to go back out there and get those elements. Now, sometimes, Jameis, like you said, they bring in a case and it's ripe and it's ready to go. But my office, the United States Attorney's Office, may decline it anyway because it's not the type of case that we should be prosecuting. The district attorney's office could prosecute it, or even the state attorney general's office. So we have to be selective, and we have prosecuting partners to help us make sure that hopefully nothing goes unprosecuted that should be prosecuted. But our office is really looking at cases that have, first off, we have to have a federal nexus. That's the federal hook. There has to be like an interstate or some sort of commerce. So for example, I can't do a murder case that happened outside my office without that federal nexus. Now, the gun might have been manufactured outside of New York State, and that will give me the federal nexus. But we always have to look at that. We have to look to make sure we have venue. Is there something that happened in this district that touched us that we could use to prosecute in this district? So we're looking at all sorts of things all the time, including the impact, the federal impact on us taking the prosecution.
So let's talk a little bit about terrorism and national security. I'm quite familiar with like the larger, for lack of a better word, offices of like LA and Chicago and Eastern District of Virginia, who have kind of dedicated prosecutors who work national security prosecutions. Is that true at a place like Western District of New York?
So a few years back, it was, and that was maybe right after 9/11. They dedicated a couple of people, and there was a anti-terrorism section in the office. That lasted maybe 4 or 5 years. We just don't get those volumes of cases to have dedicated prosecutors just to anti-terrorism. So what we do now is we have prosecutors who are designated to handle those cases when they come in, but their bread and butter, their kind of day job is doing other type of cases as well. So we have 2 prosecutors in this office who, if we had a national security case come in, would take those cases.
And how would you, and you've been doing this for quite a while, how would you categorize the tempo of federal cases and also in particular terrorism cases?
They're fast and furious. It really depends on the type of cases. So tempo wise, you can have something that is 0 to 60 because it's a drug case or a gun case or a gang case. But then we have those long-term investigations, especially complex fraud cases. And right now we're doing a lot of, PPP fraud, right, from the pandemic. We're doing a lot of COVID fraud cases. And so those sometimes take a longer time because you really have to gather a lot more information. I was in white collar, and, as in any office, there's a friendly competition between us and white collar and those in the narcotics and organized crime. And so thus we would have different sayings. And in white collar, we would say, buy bus, anybody could do those cases, but can you do the complex cases? And in narcotics organized crime, they would say, they really aren't producing over there. It's taking them so long to do a case, right? So that's the friendly competition we have. But in the end, it has to be quality, right? Quality work, good work, quality work that is going to stand through appellate process.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also have some of the best federal defenders in the country out of your district too. I mean, they put on a good defense for their folks too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's dive in a little bit about the unique challenges that may be presented by prosecuting kind of an ideologically motivated case. Walk me through what that means, and does that change your dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the cases you do need that information so you understand or try to have as much understanding of why the defendant committed the act he or she committed, right? So the ideology is important. And so I can't really talk about pending cases, but what I can say, for example, that's in the public realm, we have the case of Hati Matar, who stabbed Salman Rushdie at the Chautauqua Institute. So it's an important piece of information to understand why that happened, right? We have the 514 shooting, we call it, and that's the case of Peyton Gendron. Same thing. It was important for us to understand the ideology of why that happened. But basically, we prosecute cases based on law, based on facts, based on can we meet the elements? And it's important that we focus as prosecutors on that. It's good to have background. We don't want any surprises. So I don't want someone, saying, oh, we thought he did it because of this, and it was really because of that, right? So it is important to have the background in the ideology, but that does not at all affect how we prosecute cases.
And something that's kind of near and dear to my research is looking at kind of non-terrorism charges for terrorism suspects. I'd like to get a sense from you how you determine what statute to bring against. So you've got an individual who's probably broken 10 different laws, but you know for sure you can prosecute him on one. How do you decide to go for that one versus try to build a case for those other 9?
We try to do both at the same time, but sometimes the path of least resistance is the path we should take based on the fact that we're in a job of showing that someone violated federal laws. And we need to be able to do that succinctly to get people who might harm other people out of society for a while. And we need to do that. We look at, sentencing, how long can we get in a sentence depending on the charge. But I always think about Al Capone. And because I did a lot of tax cases in my career, we all know Al Capone was a murderer, but they got him on tax charges. And I would tell agents and, visiting prosecutors when they come from other countries, look at every tool in your prosecution toolbox. Don't be wedded to one and say, well, this guy committed bank fraud, so we can only charge bank fraud. Because there may be a false material statement there, and we could charge that. And that might be the best evidence we have to get that conviction. So I think we just need to be broad, whether it's terrorism charges, financial fraud charges. We need to look at every tool in the toolbox and pull what we have from the elements of the charge and the facts of that particular situation.
Like, how do you weigh, the public's need for justice is probably not the right word, but if you get a guy on a tax charge, but he's really a neo-Nazi skinhead, and we should have got him for a hate charge, so we can designate him as a terrorist and things like that. How do you balance those type of things, and what role does the U.S. Attorney's Office have in terms of putting the finger on the scale and saying, this is a society is not okay?
We want the charges that best fit the crime. But what we have to look at is what charges can we have a successful prosecution, right? So sometimes, for example, I ran the human trafficking task force here for about a decade. And sometimes we couldn't prove that the trafficker was actually a trafficker. But what we could prove was maybe he had child pornography on his phone. That's easy. So we're going to charge him with child pornography because the end result is getting that perpetrator out of society where they cannot hurt anyone else. So I had agents argue with me, we want these charges, we want to show this. And I say, I got it, and we will try. But if we don't have the evidence to get there, we're going to take what we have, because we have other cases waiting in the wings, and we can't spend 10 years, investigating one case because you want those particular charges. We're going to look at it, and we are going to try to find the charges that best represents the crime committed. But if we don't have the elements, we're not going to spend several years looking for that. We're going to take what we have. We're going to prosecute the bad person, and we're going to move on to the next case, because there's a lot of people waiting for our attention.
So we're starting to get some questions and answers in the chat. I would encourage people to continue to have them come in. The first one that came in, I'm not going to ask you to weigh in on Department of Justice's federal policies on these things. I'll ask you a general question, which is, would your ability to prosecute be easier if you had a domestic terrorism statute?
No, I don't think so. But I guess I would have to look at the statute to actually answer that in an absolute. But I think we have volumes and volumes and volumes of federal statutes. There is something there for everybody. Did you know there's literally a federal statute that you cannot use the likeness of Woody the Woodpecker or Smokey the Bear without permission? You could be prosecuted if you did that. So there's enough federal statutes there for anything and everything that could come our way.
Yeah, the old saying, if you follow someone around for a minute, you can find at least one charge to bring against them. And Crime a Day is a great Twitter account for people to follow if they were interested in these type of things. Let me go through a few more of these questions as they come in. How do you, how useful, and this is a question from an intelligence analyst that's watching, how useful are the RICO laws for prosecuting terrorism offenses?
Very useful, because we could go back a long, long way. So we don't lose evidence. We don't lose, the ability to show what we would call in white collar a scheme to defraud, a continuing scheme. RICO gives us that. RICO gives us the ability to go back and reach further to get what we need to show that this perpetrator, this defendant, committed these crimes. So RICO is a very important tool in the federal toolbox, so much so that they actually have people from Main Justice, our main building at DOJ, going around the country out to the fields, to the U.S. Attorney's Office, showing the newer attorneys how to prosecute RICO cases.
I mean, this is an aside, but like, how do you all train your new, cub prosecutors? Like, how does that kind of a learning process happen? Is it just a trial by fire, throw them in front of a judge and hope for the best?
It's that and formal training. So we usually don't hire people unless they've been out of law school and have at least 2 years experience. So, they've got their sea legs under them, but they need a lot more. So we have the National Advocacy Center, which is in Columbia, South Carolina. There's a 2-week, we call it boot camp, but it's trial advocacy training. And there's training all the time on grand jury, on evidence, on discovery, on everything, the basics you need to know. And then there's advanced training on money laundering and complex fraud cases and terrorism. And so there's a lot of training within DOJ at the NAC. We call it the NAC. But here in the office, we have monthly trainings, lunchtime trainings on different things that may come up during trials. We have mandatory trainings for DOJ every year, which is kind of out of control right now, but a lot of training. And then we just put people in front of the judge. But every new attorney who comes here gets a mentor who's a senior attorney to pair with. We have fantastic supervisors who are all experienced former line attorneys. And, sometimes it is just trial by fire.
And another question from the chat. Are there certain crimes that are kind of percolating up more so than they were in the past? Meaning that, are you seeing kind of cryptocurrency or elder fraud in a way that you hadn't seen in the past? Or what's the new hottest crime, for lack of a better term?
I would say something like elder fraud. And I mean, listen, the criminals are sophisticated, right? And people are living their lives and they're not always paying attention. There's a lot of crime against college students right now, a lot of crime because of like Venmo or PayPal or Cash App. And people are saying, oh, you need to send us this money. We're going to rent the apartment. We're going to sublet. We're going to do different things. And this happened to one of my daughter's roommates. And she said, okay. And they said, oh, we sent you too much money. Can you send it back? And she's out of thousands of dollars, a college student. We know this happens to the elderly people all the time. But there are scams, IRS scams. I had one case, and it was absolutely insane, where a guy was defrauding distressed small businesses by saying, I can help you get out of distress. Give me your bank accounts. And people did, because they're in distress. And then he would put 20 different names on the bank account. And by the time they realized that he was a fraud and he was taking all their money, they would tell their bank, don't let this person take it. There were 19 more names. And he would also then go back and say, I'm an attorney. I can help you get your money back, and take more money from them. So the frauds are very sophisticated. But we do see a lot of elder fraud, a lot of fraud of people who just aren't paying attention to what can happen to them if people are trying to defraud them.
Yeah, and actually a lot of repeat offenders. I won't ask you about an ongoing case, but I was looking at the dockets yesterday, and you had an individual who was charged, who was on probation for fraud and got charged again for running a fraud while he was on probation. So it always becomes very interesting when you kind of look at all the cases on these things. Again, I'm not going to ask you about that
No,
case.
no, but let me say this. I had a case, and I had a case when I was a young attorney here, and it was an $11.5 million fraud, and it was defrauding mostly elderly people over 80 years old, or between 70 and 80, and it was heartbreaking. That person has been prosecuted 2 more times by my office since then. And yeah, so we have what I call serial fraudsters.
Mhm. Yep. So we have a question from an academic in the chat, which actually I like quite a bit. What, if any, would you like to see from the academic community that would help you and your colleagues with your work?
So let me start by saying I appreciate that too. I have a master's degree in criminal justice from Rutgers University, from way back in the day when I had to go for 2 years to get my master's. And, I had to take the really hard classes, not like the masters they're giving out today. And I really wanted to be an academic and study criminology, criminal justice, and victimology. What would be really helpful is, I just think, putting your finger on the pulse of what's happening in society now, doing the research on it, because that's really helpful, collecting the research and then publishing that, somehow disseminating that. It's helpful for the defense, for sure, but it's also very helpful for the prosecution. But overall, what I think is really helpful for is justice. We need to figure out what's going on in society, why people are making the decisions they're making. For example, if you have a 17-year-old with an illegal gun because he's scared to walk back and forth from his house to school, and you could show that somehow, that helps us to decide what cases we should take or what cases we may put into diversion, right? So the academic community can help us by showing us what we don't have time to know as prosecutors, because we're kind of churn and burn. But I would look at something like that, or I would expect the defense would, to help give us guidance as what we should charge, how we should charge, and how we should proceed with some of the cases we come across.
Okay. We are going to go in 1,000 different directions because the questions are going in 1,000 different directions in the chat. This is a really important one. I think we should dive into this a bit more. How do you ensure fairness and protect civil liberties in anti-terrorism prosecutions while maintaining national security?
It's tough, okay? And that's a really good question. Well, as you all know, if you're on American soil, you have the rights of our Constitution. So that's the first thing. So we're always going to protect that. And that's why some people are still in Cuba at Guantanamo Bay, because then those rights don't attach. But what we need to do is our jobs and get to the bottom of any kind of crime that may have been committed, especially something as serious as terrorism. And so we will use the regular tools that we use in any other case to try to get the information we need to properly and constitutionally prosecute cases.
And so I'm going to keep going down this bucket because there's a few other questions like that. How do you ensure, prosecutorial discretion is a very powerful tool, right? Deciding not to prosecute is as powerful as deciding to prosecute in many ways. How do you prevent prosecutorial overreach on cases. The example this person asked was, about the Stop City RICO charges down in Georgia. Now that's a state charge; it's not a federal charge. But in general, how do you put the guardrails up on prosecutors that are trained to be aggressive just by their very nature?
Yes, that's a really good question. And since I've become U.S. attorney, I realized that was a cultural change we needed to make. So no more prosecutions, guilt by association. And what I mean by that is if I'm living in a house with somebody who's maybe selling drugs, but I'm living there because that's my brother and I have nowhere else to live. And they get the evidence, the prosecutors of law enforcement get the evidence to charge the brother. Why are you charging the sister? Just because I'm living there. That's guilt by association. We don't do those prosecutions anymore. I need evidence. I need you to show me that there's confidential informant saying they bought from me. There's other evidence showing that I was involved in this drug dealing, not just that I was living there, right? So sometimes we could charge people under Title 18 United States Code, Section 4, which is you didn't report an illegal activity, but that's really it's just not fair in the sense that I have nowhere else to live. So I'm going to be homeless or I'm going to live with my drug dealing brother. Those are my choices. So we're not prosecuting guilt by association anymore. We're also not prosecuting obstruction or making a false material statement when somebody is a bystander to a crime and law enforcement interviews them and they say, I don't remember. And then boom, you could charge them, right? Because they're lying. You're standing right there. We got the camera. We got the film. We see that you see what happened. What do you mean you don't remember? But we're not charging those cases anymore. We need, at least under my tenure, we need hard evidence to show that someone is obstructing. So if someone was involved in a crime, that's a different situation than if somebody was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you think about it, that could be any of us. We could be standing on a street corner, see a car accident, and we've just become a witness, right? And if we make a mistake or we don't want to be involved, and many people in these type of crimes do not want to be witnesses. They do not want to be federal witnesses for a good reason. They're worried about their safety, their family safety, the neighborhoods they live in. And if they say, I don't remember, I don't really consider that a false material statement, and I don't consider it obstruction. I consider it a person who wasn't involved in a crime, just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And maybe we could cultivate them and work with them to explain to them the right thing to do is to cooperate with us. And maybe we can't, but they surely should not get caught up in the net of the criminal justice system because they're afraid.
Yeah. So the next question actually is a statement and then a question. The first statement is go Bills. And then the second question is probably a little bit harder and it may not win like the Bills will, which is how does your office use or don't use Maine Justice to help prosecute terrorism cases? In particular, Department of Justice's domestic terrorism section.
Okay, so can we just stay with Go Bills?
We can go Bills until they play the Commanders, and then no more. You can beat the
Okay.
Ravens. It's fine. It's barely a team, but the Commanders you can't touch.
So the Department of Justice has the National Security Division, NSD, and we are not allowed in the fields at the U.S. Attorney's Office to prosecute terrorism cases without them being involved. So that's how it works. We don't have a choice. They are involved, and that's good because they have the expertise. Because remember, their attorneys are doing nothing but terrorism cases. The attorneys in this office, my attorneys, are doing everything that happens in the Western District of New York. So sometimes you need that expertise, right? So we work with Maine Justice components, NSD, the criminal division. We work with PINS, which is Public Integrity Division. We work with a lot of civil rights division. And same thing with civil rights cases. There are certain civil rights cases we alone cannot prosecute. The Civil Rights Division has to have its staff with one of their attorneys. So it works out great because those components have expertise that we don't have, but we have a lot more trial experience, courtroom experience, and of course, we're on the home field here, so we have that advantage as well.
So the next question would be, at NCITE, we've actually for the last 2 or 3 years, my colleague Pete Simi at Chapman University and I have looked at federal prosecutions of individuals who have threatened public officials. right? And so we've seen a giant rise in federal prosecutions. And some of that may be a reflection of Department of Justice deciding to take these cases federally in the ways they hadn't in the past. And some of it could be a reflection of the threat environment of these things. As the first Black woman to hold that position as a prosecutor, I have no doubt that you've been subject and victim to a number of different threats. Walk me through what prosecuting communicating a threat across state lines looks like. Is that a hard case to bring, and what are the dynamics there?
Yeah, it depends. As with everything, it depends on the evidence that we collect. So, for example, if somebody calls and starts making threatening phone calls to someone, well, we got voice ID now. We've got, something that's kind of an easier case to prosecute than threats over the internet when you don't know who's on the other side of the computer. So we've got to do a lot more investigative work to understand. It wasn't just I left my computer open and some, wacky person in my house or at the coffee shop went and made threats on my computer, right? We have to trace that back. But so it really, the answer to your question depends on the evidence that's presented to us, how difficult it is. But you're right, we have been seeing a lot more of those type of cases. We have been aggressively prosecuting those cases because we want people to be public servants. And you shouldn't have to subject yourself and your family members to threats because you want to serve your community, the public, the United States. So we take that very seriously. Right now, again, in the public domain, public source information, we have a threat case against two of our judges in Rochester, part of our district, the eastern part of the district, where we have a satellite office. And that case is going to trial. That case is going to trial because someone really made credible threats against two district court judge and a magistrate court judge.
So a couple more Go Bills in the comment section. I guess
Yes, people.
There's a good question here, which is, how does your office work with attorneys and prosecutors overseas? Right, a lot of these cases are crossing international waters, whether it be 764 or elder fraud or any number of other scams. What does that look like when you're working with foreign governments on prosecuting individuals?
So we can't do international cases, so we really kind of don't. We work with our law enforcement partners who have legates and different people in other countries. And if we need to work with a prosecutor overseas, like to get arrest warrants, Canada, Great Britain, anywhere, we have to go through Office of International Affairs, OIA, which is another component at Main Justice, and they take care of all that. So we personally, as prosecutors out in the field, we don't do that. We're not allowed to do that. And I'm really glad for that because there are little nuances in different countries. For example, I had extradition cases from Canada. And like I said, I could look out my window and see Canada, but it once took me 7 years to get somebody back.
Mm-hmm.
So that was through OIA. I had cases where, we had defendants in Mexico. Sometimes that's a lot faster. So it really depends on the country. And again, the attorneys at Office of International Affairs have expertise and they have it set up by countries, and different attorneys work with just specific countries in their portfolio. So they know exactly what to do.
Thank you. So I have two more questions and we're gonna hit against time. The first one is one I was always trained as a researcher and journalist to ask, which is, what did I not ask you today that you would have liked to talk about?
This was a great array of questions.
You're just saying that because I'm in front of you. You're being nice. No.
No, I mean, the only thing I would say is how important the community is to law enforcement and what we do. And so part of my tenure has been pushing community outreach, not just of myself, but of all the attorneys in this office, and actually everybody, all the staff and attorneys in this office, because if the community knows you, you're a person they could trust, and they'll come forward and they'll tell you things. And that's where you're getting the best information, the best tips. And one thing I would love to do, and I've always said this as a prosecutor, it is a great day when I put myself out of business because there are no more cases to prosecute. Now, we know that's never going to happen. Unfortunately, there's job security in this. But if we have the public coming to us and saying, hey, I saw something weird happen last night and it looked like, something maybe you guys should look into, and we go and we realize people are selling drugs or guns from a house, or people, human trafficking, if we could stop crime, because we can't be everywhere, but the community people are everywhere. So that's the only thing I would add. Community outreach, community buy-in, and that's why I started Feds Demystified. I want people to know what we do, that we're regular people trying to do our jobs just like they are, but our job is to protect them.
So my final question, and then we'll wrap up. You've been an assistant U.S. attorney since 1995.
Yes.
3 decades at Department of Justice, a U.S. attorney for the last 4+ years. What do you want your legacy to be?
That's a really hard question to think in the moment about your legacy. But if anything, that I honestly and justly prosecuted people, that I listened to all sides to try to ensure I made the right decision. I'm human, and I'm sure, sometimes I've made mistakes, and I'm sure there are people who have different thoughts about things and think I made the wrong decision. But the one thing I could tell the public is I put my everything into this position, and I want my legacy to be she was honest, fair, just, and an incredibly hard worker. And also the great people that I hired for this office, because when I leave, I know it's locked down. We got good people here who's going to carry it forward.
That is a great way to end it. So I want to thank you for taking the time. Listen, I would have emailed 94 U.S. attorneys, and most of them would have said, no, I don't want to be peppered with questions for 45 minutes from the public. But I knew that you and Barbara and the rest of your team over there would say yes, because you've made a goal to make your office more accessible. So I appreciate your time here. Just a few housekeeping notes on this. This recording will be put on to our website, NCITE.um. The website's right there. You can look on there and grab the video on that. I want to thank the U.S. Attorney Ross for coming today and talking to us on these things. And I would encourage you to continue to sign up to our future events. Thank you.